Hello there. Good day to you. Welcome to our second edition of the history of Dutch agriculture. I introduced it the other day in the Dutch countryside, actually in the fields of Bart Kemp, the guy who started the 1 October protests against the Dutch government because they, try to limit what we're doing in agriculture. We try to limit pollution. Something grew out of hand. I introduced it telling you that a Dutch farmer in the beginning of the 19th century produced 50% more than a French or a German farmer. How come? That's what we're going to talk about with Niek Koning. Niek Koning in Dutch. It's like Willem de Kooning, but 1 O less. Niek is a sociologist by training. He's an historian. He's a political theorist. He is he became a universal social scientist in the field of agriculture. He's very well versed in the long lines of history, and we're going to talk with him about the nature of Dutch agriculture. How did it come into being during a long line of perhaps even 8 centuries? That is what is necessary to understand where we are today. So in my caricature, I said a Dutch farmer could produce 50% more than a German or a French farmer. That helped us to sell to the neighbors in the 1850s in the economic boom. Something went wrong. There was an agricultural committee in 1886, and that helped us even more to produce more foods, sell more foods to our neighbors, and become this tiny little country next to the North Sea, feeding the world. Now, what is true of that caricature? Niek, I'm very happy to have you on this show. What we're going to do is we talk to you about this we talk with you about this caricature. You will correct it. And after that, we'll correct the image we're creating right now with you and 2 others. And that is the way to create a story, because there are always nuances. What is true, nobody knows. But we're going to try to make an understandable history of where we are. Now, Niek, you were a professor at the University of Wageningen. Your PhD was on the history of agriculture. What happened and what was true of my story, but how did we start out in the 19th century feeding per farmer 50% more people than the average German or French farmer?
Yeah, that's about true. The picture is true. So we had an advance, and we were within Western Europe, together with Denmark and Britain, we were the most productive agricultural country. And the history of that has long roots. And basically, you can say that there were 2 major causes. One was agricultural technology. Already in the medieval time, we had the development of the heavy horse-drawn plow. Before, we had only the light hook plow. And with that light plow, you could only till light soils, like many soils in the Mediterranean area. So in the classical time, in the early Middle Ages, the center of the European economy was south of the Alps. But thanks to that heavy plow, we could now till the much more fertile but heavy soils north of the Alps. And so gradually you see a shift of the center of gravity of the European economy from the south to the northwest.
And when was that in the Middle Ages? The 11th, 12th, 13th?
Yes, about that. What we call the High Middle Ages. It's not exactly to date, but you can say basically this started in the 11th, 12th, 13th century.
And just by an iron plough?
Yes. In fact, it was not yet a full iron plough. It was a heavy plough with increasingly iron parts, and which was drawn no longer by oxen, but by horses. And in that way, you could till soils that were too heavy to till before, which was fertile, but too heavy to till. Now you could till them. That allowed an increase in our population. That allowed the growth of cities. And then, of course, the most well-located areas in Northwest Europe were the areas that were located near water. The Netherlands bordered on the North Sea, and it was the delta of the Rhine and other major rivers in Europe. And if you realize that before the Industrial Revolution, transport by water was about 10 times cheaper than transport over land, then water didn't separate areas, water connected areas. And so we were within that larger Northwest European region that now started to develop. And within that region, we were well located to develop trade. Trading cities, around those cities, you saw horticultural zones. And we already started to import coarse grains from Eastern Europe. And we started to export butter and cheese to the London market. Also, because not all of our soils were very suitable for cereals, parts were more suitable as pasture. So we used this situation to specialize already a little bit in livestock production. And we already in these medieval times started to import cereals.
Now, Niek, hold on, because this is very important even for Dutch people. And I'll tell the audience that we're going to start a series as well in Dutch, even in more detail, and we'll bring the outcome of that in English back in English. But what you just said is we've always been in livestock. And that is the big discussion nowadays. There is too much livestock, but we already did that in the end of the Middle Ages.
Yes, but of course, you don't have to think about the current kind of intensive livestock production. And we had a lot of arable farming. We had a lot of mixed farming. But compared to other European areas, we were already somewhat more specialized in livestock.
Mm-hmm. And what we did is...
some other countries too. Yeah.
And what we did is we sold. So we had cows. We produced, of the milk, we produced butter. We sold it to London. And with the money we earned, we bought wheat in the Baltic states.
Yes. Yeah, not just wheat, but different kinds of cereals. But that's what we did. Yeah, and of course you shouldn't exaggerate this. The major part of our production was consumed in the Netherlands itself, but we already started to export a few percent of our production, and indeed, in the first place, to London. And then much later to the growing German industrial cities of the Ruhrgebiet. But then you are already talking about the 19th.
Okay, so because of our position on the rivers and on the North Sea, we could travel easily to the Baltic states. We could export easily to London. We could export easily to Germany. Our agriculture has always been intertwined with trade.
Yeah, and we already have certainly the coastal areas of the Netherlands already had a quite commercialized agriculture in that time. So for centuries, we were very market and trade integrated.
And that is the reason why we were able to why a Dutch farmer was able to feed 3 persons and a German and a French farmer only 2.
This allowed us, this led to a number of advantages. We had those trading cities because we were very close to those cities. We had low transport costs. We had a lot of urban materials which we could use as fertilizer or as feed. Take the beer breweries. The residues from beer brewing could be used as feed for our animals. So the closeness to those cities and the closeness to London gave us a number of advantages. And this allowed us to intensify our agriculture and to make it more intensive than in inland France or inland Germany.
We had more nutrients to put into our system. We had indeed the residues of human living were used as input for our farming systems.
Yeah, and we had more outlet possibilities. We could, because we had those trading cities, we could also produce perishable crops. We quite from an early date, we also had quite some horticulture. You cannot produce a lot of horticultural products somewhere in an inland part of the continent because it's perishable. But close to the cities, you can do it. And we had, for example, industrial crops. A lot of non-foods were also made from agricultural materials.
Such as?
A lot of things, hemp for making rope. We had an important hemp production. Hemp should be heavily fertilized, but we had this livestock. We had these residues from the cities, so we could do that.
Because of a rather densely populated country with cities, this agricultural system flourished and intensified. It wasn't as intensive, obviously, as it is today, but that is that is what it developed from.
Yeah.
And so now we arrive at the in the 19th century. There is this economic boom in the 1850s, and then at the end of the 19th century, in the third or even last quarter, the ships arrive from the US, from the New World. First with guano, and later on with cereals. What happened there?
But that's, I heard you say we had this economic boom, but in the long term, the economic boom was not so important. And we had a whole economic boom in the 17th century. That was the old flourishing period of the Dutch economy. And indeed, we had a short boom in the third quarter of the 19th century. That's true. But at that time, in Dutch agriculture, it was not stagnant. It gradually continued to evolve, but there were no dramatic changes. at that time. The dramatic change was what our historians sometimes call the big agricultural crisis, the global agricultural crisis in the closing decades of the 19th century. And what that meant was basically that we had this industrial revolution, which was mainly a fossil fuels revolution, which led to the transport revolution, so that now, all of a sudden, it became possible to grow cereals in Siberia, on the American prairies, and ship it to Europe. And that caused a dramatic decline of international agricultural prices. And that forced countries to respond. And that response evolved differently in different countries. For the French, the Germans, they had no other solution than to introduce some measure of protection. They had to support their prices, to introduce protective tariffs. Otherwise, their farmers had no means anymore for investment. But because we had this productivity advantage, we could make a different decision. And we decided to organize a new productivity leap. So we already had a productivity advance, but now the government stepped in, came up with a whole network of agricultural schools, agricultural experiment stations, extension officers, etc. And that increased the productivity advantage that we had. We were not the only ones to do this. The Danish, who were in a comparable position, also the North Sea, also these waterways, also already somewhat specialized in livestock, and they made the same decision. They postponed protection, like we, until the 1930s of the 20th century, and they did the same thing. The British had, in fact, the most modern agriculture in the world, technologically, but they had the disadvantage that they were also the first industrial country, and they had high wages. So they didn't have a special advantage, although technically they were the best, but their costs were too high. So they couldn't make this choice. But what they basically did is they sacrificed their agricultural development. Their industry was the number one industrial exporter to the world market. They put all cards on industry. The Americans, they were the source of this flood of cheap grain. But for them too, this was a difficult time because they were also faced with this price decline. But they were an agricultural exporting nation. They also had a big advantage in agriculture, not because they had a very intensive agriculture like we had, which had already a century-old history of productivity increase. No, but they had plenty of land. They had this new railway system. They were the front runners in agricultural mechanization. So in their way too, they had an advantage, and they did exactly the same thing as the Dutch did. In about the same period, they introduced experiment stations, agricultural research. They had the second Land Grant College Act, so they invested heavily in their agricultural education, etc. And so they reinforced their productivity advantage. And in that way, they could also postpone agricultural protection, like we did, until the 1930s of the 20th century. And then basically all Western countries resorted to protection.
And why did we all have to resort to protectionism?
That's because, in fact, in agriculture, you are faced with what economists call a fundamental market failure. The Industrial Revolution stimulated the supply of agricultural products in all possible ways. The transport revolution, agricultural fertilizer, motorized agriculture, you name it, of irrigation, you name it. But so this stimulated overproduction, which also happens in other sectors. But in other sectors, the way to cope with this is often a very drastic concentration of production in very large firms. And that was not possible in agriculture, because the same industrial revolution that stimulated overproduction did not revolutionize the economies of scale in agriculture. And that had to do with the fact that it was biological. Agriculture is centered on biological processes that cannot so easily, technical control cannot be organized so easily in agriculture. And agriculture is spatially extended, so that you have those rapidly increasing internal transport costs, etc., etc. So bigger firms, bigger agricultural firms could not so easily outcompete the smallholders. So smallholders continued. The substantial investors, in fact, left agriculture to self-employed farmers, mainly. And those self-employed farmers could survive because they accepted a quite moderate remuneration for their labor. But they were even less than bigger firms capable of controlling their supply, of organizing market power. They tried forming cooperatives. But as long as you have not really a cooperative cartel, you cannot really control the market. And the Americans tried in the 1920s. They had what they call the Shapiro movement, really an attempt at creating nationwide agricultural cooperatives, but it failed. And so the only solution was that the government stepped in and that the government organized the market, stabilized the prices, and when needed, supported the prices to a level where somewhat more efficient farmers still had margins left for investment.
Okay, let me try to sum this up. Our agricultural economy has always been intertwined with trade. There were cities, we could develop a kind of intensity, a kind of efficient agriculture. And then technology comes around, the world becomes a global production place. You can produce huge amounts in the US and in other places, you can ship them. You overproduce and you wreck the system. And that is what happened from the 1880s onwards till the 1930s. That is the first global agricultural crisis.
And beyond,
because we're still coping with it.
We are still in that situation, I think.
from the perspective of an historian.
Yeah.
So we're producing too much. And then there is a Second World War. After that, we have our famous Sikkel Mansholt, the famous first Euro Commissioner of Agriculture, and he created the Common Agricultural Policy. What happens from there on? Because that policy was meant to regulate in a certain way. What happened? And did it work out as a regulation, or did it work out in the opposite position?
Well, let's say first for Dutch agriculture, the European Union was vitally important. For we had made this choice to reinforce our competitiveness, which made us big exporters of agricultural products and importers of many other agricultural products like feed. So we depended on access to other countries' markets. And one problem of the 1930s, of course, was that a lot of countries closed their markets. Or if you are talking about Britain, they reserved their markets for their own colonies. So we wanted free access. We needed some protection, but we needed a bigger internal market, not just the Netherlands. Now, then we had the Second World War. And after the war, European politicians thought, no, never again. We have to organize Europe in a way which guarantees the peace. And the analysis was that one major cause of the war was the competition between French and German industry. So a solution was to unify the industrial market so that there was no political competition possible. But the French said, well, the German industry is more competitive than our French industry. So we are willing to import German Volkswagen. Then Peugeot and Citroën will see their market share somewhat restricted, but we want something in return. And we are more competitive than the Germans in grain. So if we give our industrial market to the Germans, we want to have the German market so that we can export grain to that market. And that was the deal. So agriculture had to be included in the European Union. And then we, the Dutch, as a small country, were very happy with that situation because we had a parallel interest to that of the French. The French had that grain to sell in Germany, but we had our dairy products and our pork to sell in Germany. And so that was also very good for us. And so that's how the European Union started and was important for us.
So
what Mansholt did, Mansholt, by the way, for the Americans, Mansholt was in fact a kind of Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was the architect of the New Deal agricultural policy system, which persisted for many, many decades after the World War. And Mansholt can be seen as a similar architect of European farm policies. What it in fact amounted to was that each of those 6 countries that originally formed the European Union protected its agriculture. And 5 of them already did so from the late 19th century. And the Netherlands did so from the 1930s. Now, the European farm policy is in fact a harmonization of those 6 different national protective systems.
Right.
So now we have one common agricultural market, and we still had protection, but at the outer border of that European Union.
And for the Dutch, that was very profitable. So,
yes.
What the international audience wants to know is, how did this country become so innovative? Well, we've always been, because we had our position on the River Rhine, on the North Sea. The water connects. Our agriculture has been intertwined with trade. We intensified, and we did it all the time. And then in the last quarter of the 19th century, we had this Agricultural Committee of 1886. We had become kind of lazy. We started kind of an industrial policy, setting up our schools, our famous triple helix policy, which in the end is just what history was already doing for us. The historical line, it's all within our historical logic of a relatively well-off area, connected by water, connected by and agriculture, connected by trade, etc. Everything we said, and then we come out of this Second World War, and we profit from the industrial policies of Germany and France. We jump on the back of France, and we start exporting to the rest of Europe. That is, we can finally do the trick we've always wanted to do, and we already did. That is a story. Is that correct?
But now the situation starts to change.
Now, that is, now?
The last few decades, you can say. And because...
as from the 90s. Niek, let's be precise. As from the 90s, 80s?
Yes, you can say basically from the 1980s to 1990s. It's not possible to pin a precise date, of course. But around the turn of the century. Because the old European Union situation was very good for us. Our farmers were the most productive or among the most productive of the European Union. We could export to the other European countries. We were protected at the outer border of the European Union. We needed some protection, but not as much as the German farmers or the farmers in central and southern France. So the game we played was that we left it to the French and the German farmers to fight for an adequate level of protection. And we leaned in our chairs and we said, well, a somewhat more modest form of protection is good for us, because then those smaller German and French farmers will lose the competition. We can take over their market share. And that was the situation. What's now changing is that the Dutch population continues to grow. Urbanization continues. Half of the Netherlands is urban area, so to speak. So we have no longer the advantage of producing in the zones around the cities. And you could say, in a way, we are now producing in the sphere, in the immediate sphere of the cities themselves, within the cities, so to speak.
We're doing urban farming, Niek. We're doing urban farming right now.
Yes, but then but not in the literal sense. What I mean is that most of our farmers have, in fact, changed in a kind of urban farmers. And that makes that they are now faced with a lot of restrictions that are imposed by the political dominance of the urban population. So we have increasing environmental restrictions. We have urban planning. We have spatial planning restrictions. And that makes it more, we have higher and higher land prices. So this makes life for Dutch farmers less easily. So gradually, this competitive advantage we had as Dutch farmers is eroding. And now in fact, our situation comes closer to those of the German and the French and Italian and Spanish farmers. So now we cannot, just a very low level of protection is no longer so good for us. Our markets need to be organized just like those for other farmers. On the other hand, we have this agro-industrial system in the Netherlands, which has always co-evolved with Dutch agriculture, and which has been a boon for Dutch farmers because this also helps us we are very good processors, we are very good traders. Thanks to agro-industry, we could export all over the world. All over the world you can find Dutch baby milk, etc. But now, gradually you see some divergence between the interests of agro-industry and the interests of the average Dutch farmer. Because agro-industry, it has always catered for Dutch farmers and processed Dutch farmer products, but they can also process products from very different parts of the world. And so you see that the Dutch industry starts to source from other countries. They can get those starch potatoes also from Eastern Europe. There they have more abundant lands, cheaper labor, etc. So, and there I see a divergent political. If you talk about agricultural policy, it is no longer so that free market policies and moderating protection is so clearly in the interest of Dutch farmers, but it is in the interest of Dutch agro-industry.
So, Niek, to sum this up, actually the farmers' interests of modern Dutch farmers align with farmers in Germany and France and Belgium, whereas the processing industry's interests are still in the free market. We're huge exporters, and the interests of companies like Friesland Campina, Kosum, and so on and so forth are free market interests. They just need to source raw material at a competitive price, and Dutch farmers can't produce anymore at competitive price levels. And that is where the watershed is. This is where we have to reinvent ourselves.
Yeah.
What is going to happen? What is the next phase from a historical perspective? Because the historical perspective is very clear. We could intensify because for all of the reasons we've mentioned.
Yeah.
Now we're at a watershed. So we need to choose. And from the basic, very structural, historical logic, what is going to happen historically?
I think up to now, our biggest farmer organization is still in this older framework, this older mindset.
They don't get it. They just don't get it.
A very clear example is the European milk quota system, which existed until a few years ago. The Dutch dairy industry has also had that system was introduced in 1984 because we had huge surpluses of skimmed milk powder and butter, which could only be dumped at increasing cost on the world market. That situation became more and more expensive, and it caused a financial crisis in the European Union, which was solved by introducing individual farmer quotas for milk. Now, that system allowed the surpluses the surpluses dwindled to a tiny percentage of European production, and that allowed to maintain a reasonably remunerative milk price. But the Dutch dairy industry had a problem with it because they wanted to expand their market share. So they wanted to get rid of that system. And then the big farmer union thought that that was also the Dutch farmer interest. So they were fighting for the abolition of that system, speculating that when the milk quotas would be abandoned, then the traditional productivity advantage of Dutch dairy farmers would allow us to again expand our market share in the European Union. But that didn't happen. The system was abolished, partly by the lobbying efforts of the Dutch agribusiness lobbies, but because of those environmental restrictions, immediately a kind of new milk quota system had to be imposed, but not on European milk farmers, but just on Dutch milk farmers. It were not milk quotas, it were phosphate quotas, manure quotas. And so now our production was restricted, whereas other areas in Europe could expand their milk production. And so there you see that what is in the interest of our agro-industrial companies is not necessarily really in the interest of Dutch dairy farmers. Now, I think that we have this competitive agro-industry is a very good thing, but we also have the interest of those farmers, and I think this situation needs to be clarified. It's not a good thing that the people who are the representatives of Dutch farmers, in fact, are defending interests of agro-industrial companies that are no longer parallel to the interests of their own members. And that's what I want to say.
And that is exactly what we see, because the farmers opposing the restrictive regulation that is now going to be put in place are farmers, and they don't want the agro-industrial companies to represent them. And that is what a system, is blocked. It's blocked now. The situation is blocked. Do you have the impression, I just said it, do the farmers' organizations, do they actually, we just said, they just don't get it. They are talking from a history of centuries ago, but they don't see the history of the future yet. Is that correct? Or are they unaware of what they should do, and are they just continuing what they always did? What is it? You're a sociologist as well.
I think they are indeed they are in a mind frame which is a logical mind frame historically, but they don't realize that the situation now has really changed, and that this means that the farmer interest starts to diverge from the agro-industrial interests. And not clean break maybe, and it's a gradual thing, but it would be good that everybody realizes that the situation has changed, and that the interests of the farmers are not automatically the same as the interests of agro-industrial companies. And even if those companies are formally still farmer cooperatives.
Now, one final question. How did this country become so innovative? We know it. So Dutch farming production will have to retract because we cannot compete anymore on our technological competencies. We're just too expensive. What about innovation in the near future? What will happen? Will we just fade out as an agricultural nation? Or are we going to rise as a phoenix from his ashes and invent something new, just as we did in shipping?
Now, first, I think innovation within the agro-industrial complex will continue, I think. But the primary production, their primary production will gradually shift to areas outside the Netherlands itself. But if I look to agriculture, there are parts of agriculture that, even in the current very urbanized situation, will remain very, very competitive. And think about horticulture. And we have this horticulture under glass, which is about 1/3 of the production value of Dutch agriculture. Well, that's very competitive, and innovation still evolves very rapidly. Then big advantages are still derived from the fact that we have one of the biggest ports in the world, Rotterdam. And so we can easily import all kinds of animal feeds and transform that into animal products, but no longer in the old way. This will be a very large-scale, very modern production. And another part of our livestock production will possibly shift to parts of Europe where you can much cheaper produce the arable products that you need for that livestock production. So I think that we will no longer, today we have a very concentrated pig production in parts of eastern Netherlands, in relatively small farms. Now, I think that will shift gradually to maybe Eastern Europe, where you can much more easily combine intensive agriculture with arable production. So part of it will maybe shift to Eastern Europe. Part of it will be organized in a very, very, let's say, industrial way, close to the port of Rotterdam. But in fact, you are hardly talking about agriculture then. It's really big industry then. So not all dynamism will disappear. Now, there will remain a lot of dynamism, but the sourcing will shift partly to other countries than the Netherlands.
Mm-hmm. So primary production, to sum up, the innovation won't be that much in primary production, or we will shift
in horticulture. In horticulture and in very intensive industrializing industrial forms of intensive livestock production.
Yeah.
But in other parts of agriculture, we will maybe see somewhat less dynamism in the future. Yeah.
So the dynamics will be especially in the transformative business, the agribusiness further on in the chain. Horticulture is there to stay because it's very special and it's very industrial.
Yeah.
Livestock probably will shift to the east with our knowledge and will source back the meat in order to produce meat products.
Yeah, and partly it will be Dutch farmers who will do it. You have to realize that a lot of more dynamic Dutch farmers, faced with all those new restrictions, are immigrating. You can, in the eastern parts of Germany and Poland, you can find Dutch farmers who bought land there and organize production in a very efficient way. So it's partly Dutch farmers who are doing it.
Okay.
There's still another development. Of course, the fact that we are now producing in the urban sphere also creates niche markets for quality products, organic products, artisanal products, etc. And this gives some opportunities to a number of farmers who cannot go along so easily with a very industrial model of agriculture.
What will the volume be in terms of stomach share?
Well, I think it is often. I think it's often somewhat overestimated. And there are quite some people who think that type of niche market production, that is the big perspective for Dutch agriculture. I think it's a solution for part of our farmers, but niche markets are niche markets.
Please state how much? 2%, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 20?
Well, maybe 10 or 15, but that is a rough guess.
As a marketeer, I would say 3 to 4 at the moment. Maybe. Okay. Niek, thank you very much for this interview. We saw briefly in an hour the history of Europe and the history of the Netherlands within Europe. And we've explained, I think, how this country became so innovative. We've explained why primary production will reduce our primary production, probably, but will import raw materials, process them, and will probably export our ways of production and will combine the two raw materials, the production of raw materials and processing, and that'll be the future of Dutch agriculture. We're going to discuss this image because history is written by, the people who write it, basically. So what do other writers and thinkers think? In a third edition, Niek will be joined by 2 other experts in English. We'll do it again amongst Dutch people. Talking in Dutch, in English isn't very, very easy, but we'll do that. And we'll start alongside this English series, a more detailed series in Dutch. And we hope to set a standard for countries to analyze themselves in order to know where they are in their agricultural opportunities and perhaps the problems they've run in. See you next time.